Today I will discuss Russian formalism and then the Bakhtin School. So this is going to be the first literary theory that I am going to discuss in this series. And this one could be a little bit difficult to grasp because there are a lot of abstract concepts in this one. So first of all, let's see the historical background or the context. Now, as we have seen previously, by the end of the 19th century, there was no single school of criticism which dominated the literary studies. Literary criticism was not even considered an academic activity. Academic research was mostly attempted to show that a literary work was a social or political product of a particular time. Some others focused on the author, that the text is personal impressions and visions of its creator, and the text is the place where the author and reader can communicate. And some others said that literary work should be read biographically, seeing how the life of the author is reflected in the work. But in the early part of the 20th century, a radical break occurred with the emergence of a group of Russian scholars who articulated a set of interpretive principles known as Russian formalism. So during the second decade of 20th century, two distinct groups of Russian scholars emerged. Moscow Linguistic Circle, which was founded in 1915, and it included Roman Jakobson, Jan Mukarovsky, Peter Bogatyrev, and G.O. Vinokur. And the second group was Opoyaz or Opojaz, which was the Society for the Study of Poetic Language. It included Viktor Shkolovsky, Boris Eckenbaum, and Viktor Vinogradov. These Russian scholars boldly declared the autonomy of literature and poetic language, advocating a scientific approach to literary interpretation. So these Russian scholars declared the autonomy of literature, that literature should be investigated as its own discipline and not merely as a platform for discussing religious, political, sociological, or philosophical ideas. And so they advocated a scientific approach to literary interpretation and setting an objective criteria to judge a literary work. These figures are considered as the founders of Russian formalism. Now, the term formalism and formalist were coined by their opponents, and they actually at first rejected these terms, believing that their approach to literature was both dynamic and evolutionary and not a formal or dogmatic one. So they framed their theory on the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, the French linguist and founder of modern linguistics. So they emphasized the autonomous nature of literature. So the proper study of literature is literature itself and not any other kind of ideas. To study literature is to study poetics, which is an analysis of a work's constituent parts, its linguistic and structural features, or its form. So to understand this, you have to understand the distinction between content and form. Content, you can say, is the plot, characters, what is happening in the text, what is the essence of the text, not the words on the pages or the language used, which is form. So they said that form includes devices, and these devices comprise the artfulness and literariness of any given text. If a work is literary or not is defined by the devices used in it, not a work's subject matter or content. Each device has its properties and each device can be analyzed. So bringing a scientific approach to literary studies, the formalist redefined the meaning of a text, which is a unified collection of various literary devices and conventions that can be objectively analyzed, as is the case with any other scientific endeavor. Formalists asserted that to study literature is to study its form and only incidentally its content. For the formalists, form is superior to content, and its main concept is defamiliarization. And this is the idea which Shkolovsky gave in his Art as Technique. So he says that the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. So what it essentially means is that a literary language is different from the everyday language. Literary language foregrounds itself, shouting, "Look at me, I am special, I am unique." So it is the language which draws attention to itself. So literary language becomes literary by producing defamiliarization, and this is achieved through the use of literary devices. So by making strange the familiar, defamiliarization or estrangement slows down the act of perceiving everyday words or objects, forcing the listener or reader to re-examine the image. And they give example of Gulliver's Travels and Tristram Shandy. The second concept is laying bare the devices. And the concept laying bare is not concealing the devices used in a work, but openly displaying them. And according to Shkolovsky, this is the most essentially literary thing a novel can do. So he gives the example of Tristram Shandy, that in the novel, Mr. Shandy's grief is defamiliarized by slowing the description to an extreme level, which you can see. Shkolovsky also analyzed narrative prose and declared that the structure of a narrative has two aspects: story and plot. Story is the raw chronological material of events. Now, what happened in the order it actually occurred, while the plot is the literary arrangement of all those incidents. That is how a story is told in a literary work. Like we can see flashbacks, flash forwards, digressions, displacements, and other things. And according to formalists, plot is just not the arrangement of incidents, but it can be used for defamiliarization. Another concept of theirs is motivation and motives. So Mashevsky called the smallest unit of a plot a motive, which we may understand as a single statement or action. There are two types of motives. A bound motive is the one which is required by the story, and the free motive is inessential from the point of view of the story. But according to formalists, free motive is the focus of art. So we can see that this approach reverses the traditional subordination of formal devices to content. And according to formalists, using formal devices is what a writer wants to do, and he uses references to reality, the ideas, themes as only the excuse to use those devices. So the content becomes the motivation for a form, and the most familiar type of motivation is what we usually call realism. And realism's strategy is to disguise its own artificiality and to pretend that there is no art between it and reality, that it is reality, which is doing exactly the opposite of what formalists call laying bare the devices. And according to Shkolovsky, Tristram Shandy is remarkable for being totally without motivation, because the novel is entirely made up of formal devices which are laid bare. Another concept is naturalization, that we refuse to allow something to remain inexplicable and we try to naturalize it. So we try to make sense of any chaotic or random utterance or inscription or event. And in the case of text, we refuse to allow a text to remain alien and outside our frame of reference. We insist on naturalizing it. So after that, we see a paradigmatic shift in formalism. As we have seen already, that formalists saw text as a heap of devices, as the sum total of all the devices used in a work. But over time, later formalists rejected this idea and they started to see text as a dynamic system. And according to them, the individual devices do not exist in isolation or vacuum. Their function, meaning, and power constantly shift depending on the whole system. Yuri Tinyanov tries to define the relationship between a literary series or system and other historical series or systems. So on the one hand, we have to understand how other systems have impact upon literary system historically, and on the other hand, we have to also understand the immanent laws of literary system itself, like how the internal rules of literature change over time. So those are the immanent laws, which are the internal rules of literary system, and the historical series, which are like economics, technology, politics, society. So now at this point, we can say that the literary devices were not fixed pieces, but their value and meaning changed with time and also with context. So the concept of device in early formalism gave way to function in later formalism. So now for formalists, literature did not defamiliarize reality, but it defamiliarized itself with changing social norms. So if a literary work is literary because it is defamiliar according to the norms of a particular time, it might become automatized or familiar in another time. For example, if someone uses archaisms, which is the old-fashioned medieval words, and Latinate words, it could have different functions in different times. For example, it could have an elevating function in an epic poem at the time when these were being written. It could have an ironic function in a satire when these words are not in regular use, or even they could become totally automatized as general poetic diction when everyone is using it. So you can see that with changing time, what is defamiliar or familiar changes. And the concept here is the dominant, which is given by Jakobson. So according to the later formalists, literary work are dynamic systems in which elements are structured in relations of foreground and background. And background is anything which is everyday, normal, automatized, which does not draw its attention towards itself, and foreground is everything, the opposite, which draws attention to itself. And what is going to be foreground depends upon the dominant of the time. And the dominant is the concept given by Jakobson in 1935, and he defines it as the focusing component of a work of art. It rules, determines, and transforms the remaining components. And we can see the examples of dominant. For example, in Renaissance, the visual arts was the dominant, and Renaissance poetry oriented itself towards the visual arts. And in Romanticism, the music was the dominant, and in realism, the verbal art was dominant. So they do not see the history of literature where the classics are timeless, they are eternal verities, but literature is always in the state of permanent revolution. Because the entire purpose of literature is defamiliarization, it is naturally forced to change over time. As soon as a specific literary work or trick becomes too familiar, it loses its power. To survive, a new generation of writers must stage a rebellion against this familiarity and invent something new and invent something completely fresh to keep defamiliarization in literature. So the Russian formalists were suppressed and disbanded in 1930 by the Soviet government because they were unwilling to view literature through the Stalinist regime's political and ideological perspectives. However, their influence continued in Czechoslovakia through the work of the Prague Linguistic Circle, which was founded in 1926, and its leading figure being Roman Jakobson, and through the work of the Russian folk tale scholar Vladimir Prop. Russian formalism resurfaced in the 1960s in French and American structuralism. And let me go to the second part of the video, the Bakhtin School. Now, the Bakhtin School arose in the later period of formalism, but it was never part of formalism. It was formalist in a sense that it concerned itself with the linguistic structure of literary work, but it was also deeply influenced by Marxism because it insisted that language cannot be separated from ideology and social life. Bakhtin himself has been dubbed a linguist, a historian, philosopher, a writer, a semiotician, an artist, a formalist critic, a Marxist critic, a literary historian, an ethicist, and a cultural critic. So he has been a lot of things. So one of the members of the Bakhtin circle, Voloshinov, argued that ideology is not separable from language because language is the vehicle of ideology. We see the world through language. According to them, words are active, dynamic signs which are capable of taking on different meanings and connotations for different social classes in different historical situations and are not abstract, fixed, or neutral units. And they were also against the abstract linguistics of Saussure, that language was not a synchronic, unhistorical, abstract system like Saussure believed. So he wanted to treat the language with its context. And according to him, verbal signs are the arena of continuous class struggle. The ruling class narrows words' meanings, but in the time of social unrest, all the different classes and groups of a society present their own meanings of the different verbal signs, which kind of presents the natural multi-accentuality of language. And from there we go on to the concept of heteroglossia and dialogism. And this is one of the Bakhtin's key concepts. According to Bakhtin, all language is a dialogue in which a speaker and a listener form a relationship. So language is always a product of at least two people in a dialogue, not a monologue. And language is that defines us as individuals. So heteroglossia literally means other or different tongues. So for Bakhtin, all forms of social speech that people use in daily activities constitute heteroglossia. For example, professors speak one way while lecturing to class, in another way to their family, another to their friends, another to the clerk, another to the server, another to the waiter, and so on. So according to him, monologue is a forcible imposition on language, which is a distortion of its true multivocal nature. And in his essay Discourse in the Novel, he distinguishes between monologic and polyphonic novels, and he refers to Tolstoy's novels as monologic, where all voices are subordinated to the voice of author, and the author is working as a dictator and is controlling what is truth and what is not. So the author's viewpoint dominates in every character. And then in polyphonic novels, there is no unified point of view. All the participants, author, reader, and characters interact as equals in creating the novel's truth, for truth requires a plurality of consciousnesses, according to Bakhtin. So there are different discourses clashing with each other at the same time in a polyphonic novel. And he appreciates Fyodor Dostoevsky's novels in this regard, as they are polyphonic. Another concept of Bakhtin is carnivalization. So the polyphonic nature of novel implies that there are many truths, not just one. And each character speaks and thinks his or her own truth. Although one truth may be preferred to other by a character, a reader, or the author, no truth is particularly certain. So there are multitude of voices heard by each character, as these voices shape those who hear them. So what develops, says Bakhtin, is a carnivalistic atmosphere, a sense of joyful relativity where there is nothing certain, where many voices are simultaneously heard and directly influence their hearers. Each participant tests both the ideas and the lives of other participants. And he gives different examples, like the example of Socratic dialogues, which is in the form of dialogues and where different point of views collide with each other. And that is the end of this video. And in the next one, I will be talking about new criticism, which is a lot more interesting and a lot easy to grasp.